There once was a time when the land was wild and free, before the plaques, the pavement, the monuments, and the houses. The land was home to the Luiseno, Cahuilla, Serrano, and Tongva natives. Their home had a name that has been buried in the past until now.
Even before it was called Mount Rubidoux, it had a place name for, and a feature for Indian people traveling through the Santa Ana River, following the water.
The mountain is sacred, right? Mount Rubidoux is sacred. If you look at it, it's visible, it's huge, it's beautiful. As it is, it's invisible. It's a big, giant, beautiful, natural being that is invisible to all those who know nothing about it.
So Pa is water, and then Pá'Čapa is like where it bends, like an elbow, like it bends. And that's where the water bends at that place.
To most Riversiders, Pá'Čapa, mispronounced Pá'Čapa, is a little residential hill that can be seen off the 91 freeway. However, that is incorrect. To show proof of this, we read from a book titled Riverside County, California, Place Names, Their Origins, and Their Stories by Jane Davies Gunther. Located in the city of Riverside, the hill bears an Indian name, meaning unknown except that the last two letters of the word form the syllable Ba, which means water, in the Shoshonean languages that were spoken in the general area before the arrival of Europeans. The name belongs rightly to the larger high detached hill or mountain that is now known as Mount Rubidoux. A name change that had begun in the summer of 1869 and finally resolved in the spring of 1879, with land surveys being accepted by the Commissioner of the General Land Office.
That whole valley there, that whole area along the river has so much history that you're looking at from Mount Rubidoux. You know, you look over and you'll see where the villages were. There's plenty of rock art and grinding rocks all along that river because many of our villages were all along there. Mm-hmm. Big Mount Rubidoux, little Mount Rubidoux where the village was, they were still there and occupied and you know, singing their songs and doing their things. But most of them were working out in the farms and ranches. They were listed in the 1890s directory for Riverside as Big Spring Rancheria, and it had all the names, and there was all mountain Cahuillas, which is what we're descended from. That was during in the 1890s when the Cahuillas had settled at that village there. By then, the houses were no longer round houses, but they were square like Americans or Spanish, but they were still out of the natural plants.
Pá'Čapa and the river were significant elements to the native communities that lived along the banks. They relied on the natural resources to help them maintain their traditional ways, all while enduring the changes that would inevitably be coming, because simultaneously, settlers such as Henry Huntington and Frank Miller were dreaming up a new vision of what they wanted for Riverside.
Henry Huntington, who is a well-known entrepreneur of the 19th century, as well as Frank Miller. So we're actually at this time in kind of mid-19th century, we're seeing the beginning of the construction of the city of Riverside. And what they were really looking for is to create a place where other wealthy people wanted to invest in. During this period, for example, in the early 1900s, we can kind of see them playing around with this idea of like a Spanish fantasy past. So you start seeing the Mission Inn at that time with Frank Miller. We also see the move from Paris Indian School here to Sherman Institute. And then you see Mount Rubidoux. And so when Huntington and Frank Miller were interested in like giving a tour of Riverside, These were three really key sites and locations in the sale of Riverside as a place that would be worthy of investment. And at this time, you see plaques going up, a lot of dedications. This was primarily used for automobiles, right? So it wasn't kind of foot traffic the way that we use it today, right? That it wasn't meant to be this recreational place of exercise. It was supposed to be part of the tour because it was this question of who had access to vehicles at this time. It was usually wealthier folks.
So I started looking more at local history books, and I did find a pamphlet about Mount Rubidoux, and it said the sacrificial rock that the Indians did their worshiping to the sun, you know, in a dramatic kind of way, was taken from Mount Rubidoux and now in the Mission Inn courtyards. So I went over to Mission Inn and looking around, there's big rocks there. I didn't see any that were marked or things like that. I'd asked people, nobody knew. It could have been Frank Miller. He was always trying to promote, you know, and get tourism.
According to a letter written by archivist Nathan Gonzalez to Miss Sisquoc, I have no idea what has become of the, quote, sacred sacrificial rock, unquote. And it was, of course, in Miller's interest to have tourists believe it was a sacred site for Native Americans, as it added to the credibility of his tourist attractions. The first and last stops were, of course, the Mission Inn, a grand symbol of the region's development. These tourist attractions came at the expense of Native people and their territories. For instance, a trolley route included a stop at Sherman Institute, where visitors could walk around the campus and witness firsthand the assimilation of children and teens. Meanwhile, Pá'Čapa underwent reconstruction to suit the need for automobiles with dedications to non-natives and notions of progress. The most tragic consequence of the transformations atop and below Pá'Čapa was the desecration of burial sites at Spring Rancheria to accommodate expensive Anglo homes along what is now known as Indian Hill Road.
The history to these places, which is fundamentally tied to Native people, is almost always erased. Tribal communities along the way are getting confronted with so many changes, economic changes, a lot of policies of erasure. The history of how people used Spanish kind of imaginary and all this romance around it, it is fundamentally an anti-Native history. It is fundamentally an anti-Native project. If you have people being moved from their homeland onto missions, what does that disassociation from your land base do to you, right? This means that you're no longer eating your traditional foods. This means that all the activity that happened between and within different tribal communities is not as thriving because evidently you start entering into survival mode. What does this do to your different forms of leadership within tribal communities, with your clan systems, right? When you have this other form of violence and leadership that's being imposed on you. That whole entire history of Spanish mission history for California Indian people has been devastating. They were engaging Native people, right? But they were still very much engaging Native people in terms of like labor.
Amidst the sweeping changes of the late 19th century into the early 20th century, settlers sought a ready workforce and turned to the Cahuilla people residing at the base of Pá'Čapa, exploiting their presence through inequitable arrangements for cheap labor. Initially, residents of Spring Rancheria comprised the primary labor force before the influx of Chinese immigrants. Native men found themselves employed as ranch hands for expanding citrus plantations, which would eventually fuel the area's citrus industry growth, along with engaging in manual labor such as adobe construction and fruit picking. Concurrently, the children of these families attending Sherman Institute often found themselves utilized through the outing program, further entrenching them in the cycle of exploitation. Frank Miller was in support of the low-wage employment of Native students as it served as a spectacle along his tourist route.
our history was one that, from the beginning of the United States government, from the Spanish to the Mexican rule to the U.S. to the state of California, was a culture that people tried to assemble, to wash away, boarding schools. And so different stories, and that's why Indian people have been reserved, right? Because we went through a period of time that if you practice your culture, you could get chastised. The story of Indian people that from the Mount Rubidoux area and the Santa Ana River wasn't even told, and it is not even being told in its true form, with the input of California Indian people. And along the way, settlers, colonialism came, and all of that never took the time to listen to the voices of the area's first people. It's never too late to continue to be the voices of our ancestors. Atrocities happened around this area, and those voices are still crying out from the ground, right? Tell them who we truly are as Indian people. Tell them about the history, the true history of the impact towards our people. So it's never too late to move forward. We have to come together as Indian people and tell our side of the story of not only what the area means to us, the plant life, the cultural stories, the ties to it, but and the kinship that goes along with it with tribes from the area. What has changed is what the community values it as. Does the community see now its name Mount Rubidoux as a Native American history? Certainly there has to be a discussion of having that presence there. So getting those involved in the political system at the state level, county boards of supervisors, city councils, being engaged to make sure that the true history is being told. There's reasons why the 215 and the 10 freeway are so close, because they were trading routes with Indian people that then were taken over and paved. A lot of roads, a lot of interstates were once Indian trails.
And do we go back and place blame? I think even in this situation, it's really important to be proactive, and education is really important. But I think it's time for this country to understand and to acknowledge something that they've erased. Historical and social amnesia is not going to help the healing of this country.
For so long, for at least 100 years, Mount Rubidoux has been a story that didn't belong to Native people. And that's where we're at right now, that it's so important that we find these stories, that we speak to community members, and we try and peel off the layers of history, because if you just go through like the top layers, well, then you don't get to Native people.
If we can't remember our culture, our history to a certain point, then the community itself says, well, then you must have lost your culture. No, we never lost it, right? What we have to do is write it down and make sure that it's there to bring forward.
We need to engage with this question of colonization, how we've come to commemorate it and normalize it in our public spaces. The land I call home is actually a land that has dispossessed Native people through many, many layers of dispossession. And how can I comfortably claim it? Where are the Native people, right? That's the conversation. Where are the Native people? I don't see them. And well, is it that Native people are just invisible, or is it that they've been systematically by design removed from spaces? And we can see with the history of Mount Rubidoux, the proprietary history, that's why. There's been over 100 years of removing Native people from that sacred place.
Why the true history has to come out. If after a certain point of time someone says this was ours, well, whose was it before then? And was it really theirs to take? As Indian people, the claiming of things wasn't there, right? And then when those come and now even claim the United States, state of California, it wasn't that it was freely there for them to claim. So I think we have to look back to the true ownership. And as Indian people, the ownership is within the land itself. We lived off the land. We follow the different plant lives and the blooming of the plants for the different seasons. So when people come and say they claim this, that's more of a European type colonial saying this is ours. And once they claimed it, they truly believed that it was theirs. And that happened here in Riverside, Mount Rubidoux. So Mount Rubidoux was traditionally Indian territory.
Native people did have a clear understanding of property. It may not have been in the form of written deeds, documents with attorneys and signatures that get processed in court. This doesn't mean that they were absent of ideas of this territory belongs to me, or this territory belongs to my family. Oftentimes, the mechanisms that Native people used to assert claims to land came in the form of songs, sacred songs, ceremonial songs, or social songs. Many of these songs include geographic places, so in the songs, they are singing about an oasis, or movement and travels, or a mountain. These songs are incredibly important for the people. If clans or families own specific songs, then they are claiming rights to the property.
When we think about proprietary history and traditional land and belonging, that is one way that Native people asserted claims to land. Okay, and so you did have to ask for permission to go into someone's land. And this is how you know that there were ideas of shared space and consent.
To be able to walk up the mountain with the kids, and that's where you told all the stories. It's so easy to displace the spirit and the history of this land. But it still means a lot to my kids. There's a lot of memories. It's a soulful memory. It's family memories. It's history. It's connecting with the land and measuring where you are when you're at the top of that mountain. And you know, we want everybody, especially right now, it's important because we're going through all this climate change, environmental emergency, a lot of things, social changes, and that's because we're so disconnected from the natural world. That's all there is to it. If you want the people to embrace and to acknowledge and to preserve and to protect a space, they have to understand it fully. And so when we walk up there, yes, it is recreation. You know, we all do the walk, but it's a different kind of a walk. It's a walk of reverence. It's almost like a pilgrimage that you do every time you go up to the top of it. It's a way for us to be able to acknowledge and to pray. It's a spiritual place.
Our ancestors were living actually there in that area up until the 1890s, and now they, are still here. That's still a sacred place to us.
If we could find a way to make sure that Mount Rubidoux as a place, this mountain isn't this passive backdrop of a mountain, but think of Mount Rubidoux as an active place, right? That has living history and that has been important to many, many generations, not just these last 100 years.
We have to make sure that our voices are being heard. So seeing what it represents today, knowing that what it's represented in the past is not moving forward with the same enthusiasm of the community. There's those that will go out there and post, we made it to the top of Mount Rubidoux, but yet did they give credit to the Indian people and to that land? It'd be something that the day would come that those that climb Mount Rubidoux, hike the trail, make it to the top, and give respect to the Serrano, the Cahuilla, Luiseño people from this area for being able to get to that point. We're not at that point yet, but it's a point that we could strive to get to.
Mount Rubidoux has been a story about wealth and progress. But what's on the opposite of progress? It's the uncivilized. And who's the uncivilized in U.S. history? It's been historically Native people. Does that feel right? Does that sound right? We ask you to be curious about all of the plaques and dedications. Be curious about who is being privileged in these narratives and who is being left out. The resilience of the ancestors lives within each descendant of the Luiseño, Cahuilla, Serrano, Tongva, and all other Southern California natives. Attempts to erase our culture and traditions have failed. Our oral histories have stood the test of time, a testament to our enduring strength. Our people suffered dispossession. We persevered. The encroachment and seizing of our homelands was a temporary setback. The spirit of our ancestors tells us it is time that our histories be told, and today we stand in their presence. We are the people of this land, of Pá'Čapa, our living heirloom.
Even being here in this interview and speaking to all these issues is because of the resiliency of our ancestors that have instilled in us to go out and talk about who we are as California Indian people, specifically Serrano and Cahuilla for me, but for all of us, because it's the resiliency that they had that we're able to still be here and sing these songs and talk about these issues. There's a reason why we're talking about it here today, right? I think we have to move forward now and make sure that the true interpretive of the first people of this region is a component that when someone hikes that trail, that they're seeing it from the beginning of the trail to the end of the trail and paying that due respect to our ancestors. It's not just us that are speaking here today. Through us lives our ancestors and the voices that we speak. So I dedicate everything to them for the things that we've said.